BC's election is shaping up to be unlike any in recent memory. The NDP is seeking re-election amid an affordability crisis and a healthcare crunch, while facing renewed opposition after a merger between the former Liberals and the Conservative Party. I'm Dave Breakenridge, and this is 10-3. Vancouver Sun politics reporter Alec Lazenby joins me to discuss the key issues in this campaign, the resurgence of the Conservatives under John Rustad, and whether any former BC Liberal MLAs could play spoiler as independent candidates. Don't forget you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. So Alec, BC voters go to the polls in a little over 2 weeks, and before we get into some of the discussion around the campaign so far, for listeners who don't follow BC politics all that closely, the landscape has really changed heading into this campaign. How have things shifted since 2020? I mean, first off, what happened with the opposition parties?
So, first of all, thanks for having me, Dave. But yeah, the BC United collapsed at the end of August after a failed rebrand in 2022, I believe it was. It was something that nobody saw coming. There was a deal struck between Kevin Falcon and John Rustad in sort of a clandestine meeting in Vancouver, in a Vancouver boardroom. And so BC United is out. They've suspended all their campaign. Most of their candidates have dropped out or running as independents. We actually have 40 independents running in the provincial election, which is a record. But I think everything to do with BC United really goes back to that rebrand that Kevin Falcon campaigned on when he went for the leadership in 2022. And it just really didn't stick with voters. There were some who were thinking, I heard one anecdote that somebody who was campaigning for BC United in the 2022 Langford by-election went up to a door and they were asked, "Oh, what church group are you from?" when they told them that they were from BC United. And so it's things like that. People didn't expect that, BC Liberals changed to BC United. Nobody had any idea, as unlike me, who lives and breathes politics as my day job, most people only tune in once every 4 years. So it's a rebrand's very, very difficult to do at the best of times. Never mind when it's happening at a time when most people aren't paying attention and you have a party that's already relatively unpopular. The BC Liberal brand was suffering and not doing very well, but it is surprising to see how it's all shaken out, because I think if you had asked me a couple months ago or asked anyone, people would have expected BC United to go through the election, not do well, but then maybe look at some type of merger attempt with the Conservatives afterwards.
And so we have this merger with the Conservatives, and we can touch on kind of the fallout from that a little later. You mentioned there's a ton of independent candidates in the race. So heading into this campaign, what's the ballot question for the Conservatives? Is it around their merger with BC United and how they kind of represent perhaps a center-right point of view in BC? Is it they're a better alternative to the NDP, who after 7 years in power are kind of adrift? What's the pitch they're making to voters in this campaign?
The pitch they're making to voters is just one of change. They're counting on this election being a change election, people being tired of the NDP after 7 years in office, a $9 billion deficit, ERs closed in rural areas. I know these are issues, especially when it comes to ER and healthcare generally, that are impacting the entire country. There's not a province that is remaining unscathed, no matter what the provincial government seems to be doing. But there's these key issues that people are struggling with, whether it be affordability, not being able to afford housing, groceries. We have some of the highest rent prices in the country. And, Premier Eby, the NDP leader, has staked his brand on fixing housing and taking big swings at these massive issues that are facing the province. The Conservatives are counting on voters being tired of the NDP and not really seeing the tangible change that Eby promised when he became premier in November 2022. I think the NDP, on the other hand, are trying to paint the Conservatives as this upstart party that has nominated some candidates with some, shall we say, interesting views on climate change and reproductive rights and other things. But going back to the Conservatives and your question, it really is very much, do people want change? And if so, they're looking at offering that change to people in BC.
As for the NDP, they're campaigning under a new leader since the last election. John Horgan stepped away from politics. Now we have David Eby in charge. What has he made the focus of this campaign? How is he positioning the NDP either as an alternative to an upstart conservative party or as deserving of an extended mandate?
He's trying to show voters that in the 18 months since he became premier that he's taken big swings at some of the issues around affordability, around housing, healthcare, and now whether or not people can see results is up for debate, but he's trying to very much paint a picture of, okay, here's where we're going on housing with short-term rental restrictions, with multi-units on single-family lots, with changing financing and all of this to make building housing easier, transit oriented development on healthcare. Okay, we know there's a shortage of healthcare workers. We're working on a new medical school. We're hiring, retaining, and training more workers. So he's trying to show that there's progress being made on some of these key issues while recognizing that they aren't going to be fixed overnight. Whether or not the electorate believes that he has the right path to fixing these problems is really going to be the key issue on election day for the NDP.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the key conversations in this campaign, or what I've noticed from outside BC, is around the conservative leader, John Rustad. He's been an MLA for nearly 20 years. He was a minister in the Liberal government under Christy Clark. But I think for a lot of Canadians, he's kind of an unknown quantity. And I know you recently spent a day trailing him while he was out on the hustings, talking to constituents, talking to voters. What's his story? And I guess how is he trying to position himself in this race?
He's trying to position himself as an everyday guy. Like, he's very soft spoken when he speaks to voters. He does have some out there views which have started to come up in the campaign. The NDP have been periodically releasing videos of Rustad talking about vaccines or talking about climate change, but he comes across as a very normal guy. He, very straight shooter, straight talker, which appeals to a lot of voters. And so I was with him up in Campbell River, and he held a couple of rallies, spoke to some Indigenous leaders, spoke to forestry and aquaculture representatives, and just really coming forward with this message of common sense, of what he calls common sense change in BC. And he's from Prince George originally. He's a northern guy. Grew up. His family was massively involved in the forestry sector up there. He actually went to UBC for a year for engineering before dropping out and moving back up north. But it would be interesting because we haven't had a northern premier in a long, long time. And so he brings something very different to voters. The issue is most people don't know who he is. And so that's really been the challenge of the Conservatives, is getting the message out there about who he is, but at the same time being careful, because some of their support does, whether or not they like to admit it, lie within the popularity of the federal Conservatives and Pierre Poilievre. So there's some of that brand confusion there as well, which is helping them out. But it's interesting to get to know Rustad, and despite being somebody who's been in politics for over 20 years, not a lot of people know a lot about him.
We'll be right back. You mentioned earlier that the race is kind of coalescing around a couple of key issues. You talk about affordability, and I think a lot of Canadians, if they look at BC and especially the Lower Mainland, that it's not a cheap place to live. And then you talk about healthcare, and as is common in a lot of provinces, that like ERs are overrun, and it's hard to find a family doctor, and there are issues around access. How are the main parties kind of differentiating themselves on the issues? And when it comes to issues that are popular with voters, is there a difference between what Lower Mainland voters are thinking of and what interior or northern voters are thinking of?
For sure. I'll answer your second question first, and then I'll go to how the parties are differentiating themselves, because I think the rural-urban divide is a massive feature of any BC election, because you've got urban voters in the Lower Mainland, Metro Vancouver, and on Southern Vancouver Island, who the issues facing them around affordability, cost of rent, density concerns, public safety are very, very different from what the northern sort of resource communities are struggling with, which is a downturn in the forestry sector, mining projects that are taking forever to get approved, uncertainty around LNG, natural gas development, the oil and gas sector writ large. And so it's very, very different. And Rustad has positioned his party, the Conservatives, as they've talked about forestry, they're talking about agriculture, which is a big issue for the Fraser Valley, whereas the NDP have really become more of that urban focused party. They're focused on housing, they're focused on increasing density so that more people have a place to live. And then both parties are really talking about public safety because that's a huge issue. Whether or not you want to talk about it as tied to the toxic drug crisis, I'd argue they're two separate things, but you've got those two issues, right? You've got the toxic drug crisis of people who are dying at enormous rates from toxic drugs, and then you've got people who are struggling to keep a roof over their head, and homelessness, and especially visible in places like Vancouver and Victoria. And so the two parties are really trying to position themselves. They both talked about tax cuts in different ways. Rustad wants to look at rent and mortgage payments, deduct $3,000 a month from income tax for people, and EB's talked about $1,000 a month tax cut for families. But they both talked about involuntary care, so they're talking a lot about the same issues, but it's how the policies that they're putting forward that differentiate themselves from each other.
Mm-hmm. One of the other features of provincial politics in BC is the existence of, while not competitive in terms of winning government, at least competitive and potentially in some ridings, is the Green Party. And after the Clark government fell, the Green Party held the balance of power, and they signed a supply and confidence agreement with the NDP to help John Horgan assume government. Where do the Greens sit in this election? Are they still a kind of a going force, or have the ability to play spoiler in a close election, or have they kind of fallen off?
It's hard to say because the Green support is kind of hovering around 10%. But the issue is that Green leader Sonia Furstenau, who was representing the Cowichan Valley, she lived up in Shawnigan Lake on the island here. She's moved down to Victoria and facing a high-profile NDP cabinet minister in Grace Lore in Victoria Beacon Hill, so that's a tough race for her. Their other MLA, Adam Olson, he had a safe seat up in Sanders North in the Islands, also on Vancouver Island, and he decided not to run again for a multitude of personal reasons. And so their two MLAs, one's gone, one's very much in tough. So it's kind of hard to see where they can maybe make inroads. West Vancouver Sea to Sky, their candidate there, Jeremy Valeroy, lost by only a few votes in actually was a recount. He won on election night, and then after a recount, he lost in 2020. And so that's the one riding where I think they can pick it up. But I think they're going to be in tough to get any seats this election. And the hope for Furstenau is that they can get a couple seats, and then in what is looking like it's going to be a very, very close race between the NDP and the Conservatives, maybe hold the balance of power in a similar way to what they did in 2017.
And earlier you mentioned that there's a record number of independent candidates, and I assume a lot of that stems from people who are upset, people in BC United who are upset about the merger with the BC Conservatives, and they decided, no, we're not going to join with John Rustad, we're going to go it on our own. Do analysts feel that there could be a wave of independent candidates winning, or are BC politics such that you really need that party recognition? And so there's not necessarily the chance that any of these independent candidates, even if they have name recognition as MLAs, would make things tricky for the BC Conservatives.
It depends on the riding, because you do have, and now I need to preface this by saying we have never had a situation like this in the province before. This number of high-profile independents. You've got former BC United MLAs like Corinne Kirkpatrick, Tom Shapitka, Dan Davies, Mike Bernier, Coralie Oakes, and then you've got some high-profile candidates that are Jackie Lee, who weren't MLAs but were also high-profile BC United candidates. Now, in BC, we've only had one independent win once, like one independent win since 1949. And so it's hard to tell what will happen, but in some of these ridings, it would be interesting to see, like Mike Bernier in Peace River South. He's got a strong brand there. He has a potential chance of winning and taking that seat away from the Conservatives. Same with Dan Davies in Peace River North, and Corinne Kirkpatrick's a wild card in West Vancouver Capilano, facing Lynn Block of the Conservatives there. So we could see a couple independents elected, and that could shift the election in favor of the NDP if the independents even take up a couple of seats, or they could be, as opposed to the Greens, the ones holding the balance of power.
And lastly, for listeners out there, when we're recording, it isn't necessarily crucial knowledge, but we are recording just after we had to move this because of the first leadership debate. You listened in on the radio debate between the leaders. Give listeners a sense of kind of what messaging that John Rustad and David Eby were trying to get out there, or what lines of attack they were taking on their opponents, and how the debate played out.
It was interesting because David Eby really came in trying to attack John Rustad for some of the conspiracy theories that some of his candidates have espoused. He actually handed a piece of paper over to John Rustad about a tweet that one of his candidates, Chris Sankey in Haida Gwaii, North Coast Haida Gwaii, had said about vaccines, saying they comparing them to causing AIDS. And Rustad pushed the paper away, and his response to a lot of those comments was really to just say that Eby is trying to deflect from his record around housing, healthcare, public safety. And it was interesting because the two of them, they did talk about policy, but it was a lot of sparring back and forth. First, kind of kept trying to drag the debate back to policy, but that seems to be how it's going to be, that Eby really tries to nail the Conservatives as this maybe fringe element, and Rustad responds by going back to the NDP's record over the last 7 years on a lot of the key issues facing voters. We've seen rural ER closures, we've seen people be unable to afford basic goods, and so that's kind of his strategy, is to not respond to those comments head on, but really bring it back to the NDP's record.
Well, I know there's a couple more debates to come and a couple more weeks of campaigning. We'll see how it all plays out on October 19th. Alec, thanks for your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Dave.
10-3 is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guest, Alec Lazenby. More from him and more election coverage at vancouversun.com. I'm Dave Breakenridge. Thanks for listening.